My name is Jerry Rackley. I'm with HostBridge Technology, and we're here to talk about legacy applications and optimizing them in terms of how they integrate with the hybrid cloud. So let me go right to our agenda. Before I do that, I do want to let you know we are recording this session, so we'll share the link afterwards. Probably tomorrow or later in the week, you'll get a follow-up email if you want to watch it again or share it with somebody. And we also want your questions, so you can use the features of our Zoom meeting room here. There is a chat feature. Feel free anytime during our session to chat your comments or your questions to us, and we'll certainly take questions as we get to the end of our session today. So with that, let me share the agenda with you. And here it is. It's a brief agenda, but it's a pretty rich one. And we're going to go through several things that are all related to our topic today on optimization and walk you through some approaches or methodologies and a framework for doing that. So let me waste no more time and take you straight to who we have with us today. We are joined today by Phil Weintraub, and Phil he managed to recently escape from IBM after a long, successful career, leaving IBM as an executive, and now he is running his own consulting practice. So Phil, thanks for joining us today. We're very excited at HostBridge that we are now partnered with you and your company around doing the work that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, so thank you, Jerry. This is very, very exciting. And in fact, let me tell the folks here a little bit what I've been doing most recently. A lot of you do know me from the time I ran IBM's mainframe software business for a number of years. My passion has always been helping our mainframe clients evolve, and that's really where my consulting practice focuses today. So what we do is we help clients who are struggling with all the issues around legacy systems and help them put a plan in place. We do the IT architecture with them. We do assessments to help them reduce costs so that they can actually invest more money in the monetization activities that they want to do. So it's really great that we're able to partner with Russ and with HostBridge Systems, just because the complementary nature of what we do. From my perspective, it's very much tops down with the architecture, working with the executive teams at my clients, and all the way down, of course, to the operations folks. But Russ and his team, with his product set, they really focus on a really critical piece of what's needed to help all mainframe clients get modernized and connect their mainframe assets to the cloud. So let me turn it over to Russ.
Yeah, Phil, thank you very, very much for being here today with us. It's our organization, HostBridge. We've been in the industry focusing on CICS and effective CICS integration products, tools, and technologies for quite some time. And as Phil alluded to, we are kind of known as the consummate geeks in regarding CICS integration. And and our view over time is that you really have to look at both angles. You have to not only look at effective optimization and integration from a bottom-up standpoint, but you really need this top-down perspective. And that's why the opportunity to lock arms with Phil and his team is really exciting to us, because together we can, in an engagement with a client, we can actually do both top-down, bottom-up. We can do the analytics, but also work at the top level, dealing with the big picture of your IBM System Z investments. Jerry?
Well, actually, I think this is me.
Okay.
So I'll just go ahead and kick right in here. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here. A lot of times, those of us who have been around the mainframe space for quite some time feel a little bit like it's Groundhog Day. And we really see trends that come over and over again. And in my practice, every week I'm talking to security analysts around the world trying to figure out, hey, so are people really still using mainframes, and what are they going to do with those things? And Are they going to stick around? And why aren't more people moving off the mainframe? Things like that. And we all who work in this area know this. And the prevalence of mainframes and how it really just runs the global economy is not a surprise to anybody on this call, I don't think. You see some metrics that are here, just the amount of code that's out there, significantly great percentage of the active code in the world that's actually running things every day is actually running in COBOL. Now, it's not just COBOL, right? In addition to the COBOL, you've got a lot of assembler, a lot of PL1, a lot of Java that's been written over the past 10 to 15 years, a lot of C, C++. So what's really clear, and frankly, it's one of the things that I usually tell my clients, if there was a way and it made sense that you would have moved that application off the mainframe, you probably would have done it by now. So really the things that are running there for an incredibly good reason. Let's go to the next slide, Jerry. And you saw there on that last bullet, it's really for the things that are running on the mainframe, it's just too darn expensive, and the assets are too valuable to simply discard them or to rewrite them someplace else. Now, that being said, we have been through a number of waves, and there's really nothing that's very different. So there's always this dichotomy that we are all struggling with and working through every day, is we all have budget pressures upon us, right? Mainframe budgets are pretty large budgets compared to more distributed budgets. In the old days, you would have said distributed. In the new days, you would have said cloud. But there's always this pressure between finding the money out of this budget to focus more on the modernization and the new functionality than just the money that's going to maintenance and keeping the lights on. So, let's talk. We're going to talk more about that. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to try and show you where companies are finding that money today, and then a little later, we're going to show you a real methodology that you can use to free up dollars to spend more on connecting your mainframe assets into a hybrid cloud environment. So I excerpted this from a Gartner white paper that's a couple of years old, but it's still incredibly relevant on, as mainframe budgets get squeezed, where do people go and look for money, right? And the first thing that all of you, I'm sure, have been doing for many years is looking at what applications you have that are running on your mainframe. For sure, there are applications over the years that you said, hey, we just don't need this anymore, and you've sunset those applications off of the platform. Then there's others that they're really important, but they're very stable and they don't take a lot of work, so you've been able to minimize the new development that goes into them. But then there's this other category of application that's very strategic for the business, that gets the bulk of the investment dollars as far as enhancing those for new functions. And that is done hand in hand with the key application owners. And there's this continuous cycle that goes on that says, okay, look for places where we can optimize, reduce consumption, reduce software spending for the environment, which is a big piece of the cost, and say, okay, where can we get that money out? And it's a very iterative kind of process that goes on year after year. Let's go ahead and flip the slide, because I want to start talking about, I'm going to hand this over to Russ, and Russ is going to talk about one of these areas, which is around the CICS applications, which is a significant amount of the COBOL code and other code that's out there. But this is a real opportunity for you to optimize performance as you connect to cloud. Russ, let me hand it to you.
Great, thanks, Phil. Yeah, if you pose the question, do you need to optimize? What are the indicators? Well, first of all, I think all of us, as playing some role in an organization that is focused on owning and operating System Z infrastructure and apps, we know there are always avenues for optimization, always, right? But we have seen recently, and again, all of these bullet points actually come from words that I've heard customers say over the past couple of years about what were the indicators that they saw that they needed to optimize something, or they needed to reassess how they were doing things. In one case, it might have been unexplained spikes and slowdowns. I'll show you a little visual a little bit later that from that particular customer. That second bullet is really interesting. Once we get into an engagement, doing some analytics work for our customers, I'm always surprised how much limited visibility they have into what's driving the CICS workload. They may know that they run transaction XYZ a billion times a year, and on average, it consumes, 500 microseconds or whatever. But trying to connect the dots as to what were the business drivers that really caused all that workload to occur, sometimes there's a lot of it. There really is a need for better visibility. You can read some of the other ones there, but in general, that next to the last bullet, I just want to camp on for a minute. We hear a lot of talk, obviously, about hybrid computing these days, and let's just take it for a given that I take it as a given that everyone on this call lives in a hybrid environment. If you own a mainframe, you own a bunch of other stuff as well. And so you live in a hybrid world, and things on the distributed side, the cloud side, whatever you want to call it, are driving the interconnection to your mainframe. And so it's that dynamic, that hybrid to CICS dynamic, that we're trying to look at and really optimize. Another organization we worked with recently put it this way. They said, we know we need to optimize, and even more than that, we know we need to modernize a number of things. But frankly, we don't know where to start the journey. Now, we've worked with some organizations who, for lack of knowing where to start the journey, have literally thrown hundreds of millions of dollars at trying to achieve optimization or modernization initiatives. But the data suggests that a lot of the times when money is spent like that, it's not well spent. And so knowing where to start, where's the low-hanging fruit, whether you're looking at it from a bottom-up viewpoint, like what we do, or the top-down viewpoint, the way Phil does in his practice, we think that's how you bracket in where the optimization potential is and where the modernization journey can begin. Jerry, let's go to the next slide. Now, I'm going to kind of talk at a top level here, and then we're going to kind of boil down to some very specific use cases. So bear with me here, because this is really our frame of reference. We start by saying that the driver of this whole optimization or many modernization processes is the desire for organizational agility. Organizations, whether it's in a pre-COVID world or a post-COVID world, organizational agility is key. Everyone wants to be able to scale up processes to meet customer requirements, and in some case, they need agility to scale it down. That was a key factor in some organizations for the last year. How do I scale down cost effectively just for an interval of time? But they also want to make sure that they have very efficient connections with their various business partners, because everyone lives in a supply chain and a demand chain today. And so making sure that they have agility, both upline and downline, is absolutely imperative. And then that really drives the examination of the infrastructure and making sure that we get a real impactful ROI from the infrastructure. Everyone obviously wants to leverage their current investment, but not only that, they want to make sure that they can evolve that investment to meet their strategic goals, but do it in a way that is well managed and is done in a way that minimizes risk. De-risking these sorts of initiatives is absolutely job one for most of our customers. And of course, then that sort of a view then informs our our view of systems performance. We all would love to obtain kind of the so-called zero latency bit of infrastructure. I've seen a lot of latency data from a technical standpoint at a lot of large organizations. It's nowhere near zero, but nonetheless, that is our goal, that we as organizations, we want to build infrastructure that can scale flexibly. But we want to make sure that it always happens securely with respect to the end-to-end processes. Now, the reality is that all sounds good, but there are some real blockers and barriers along the way. For example, poor process integration within organizations, and sometimes it's worse even in the larger the organization. That can really be a blocker or a barrier. One of the key problems that we see in a number of organizations trying to optimize their infrastructure or their application portfolio or their integration approach is just simply a lack of resources. Everyone on this call had 100 other things to do besides sit with Phil and I today. Every ZOS professional I know, whether they're in the trenches or at the management level, they are running flat out, and they are doing more today than ever before. And sometimes initiatives related to optimization, modernization, that doesn't get the time it deserves because, frankly, a lot of organizations are in the mode of just trying to keep the lights on. The other thing we see in the systems performance side as a barrier is simply a lack of ongoing infrastructure investment. And a lot of times that needs to be done. System Z and the hardware and the software, and it's not inexpensive, and so it has to be done with a degree of adeptness, and that's why I'm thrilled to death to have Phil and his team, because who better can help our customers really be able to understand how best to make prudent, cost-effective investments in System Z than someone like Phil. Jerry, let's go on to the next slide. I'm going to begin to kind of, we have one more slide here that kind of shows the general flow. So when we talk about optimization, we have a bit of a process. Phil and I are going to talk about our various processes, but ours starts with analytics. And I'm going to describe exactly what that means. And we focus on kind of a phrase I think we kind of have been popularizing it for the last few years. We call it integration analytics. In other words, we found that all of our customers, lots of large organizations, have wonderful analytics for what goes on under the covers of the mainframe. They also have very good detail and analytics about what goes on outside the mainframe. But how those worlds combine, or what I should say, collide in some cases, is a problem. It's not well understood, and there's no analytics that really let us see that clearly. That then drives the arrivement or the achievement or the definition of an optimal architecture, which then in our view, drives or promotes effective integration on the backside, which we believe is the cornerstone of creating an organization that is more agile, whether it's on the supply side or the demand side of their business. Jerry, let's go to the next slide. Now, as Phil said, we focus on CICS, and it's not like we haven't done work in other quadrants, but this is kind of our home turf and our territory. And a lot of organizations who are still owning System Z and operating it, they are running CICS and CICS-based apps. In fact, I agree with something Phil said, and that is, if it were easy to get these apps off System Z, or if there was a really good business reason to do so, or a compelling technology reason to do so, it would have happened. It would have been over. But we live in an era where the apps that are living on System Z today are there for a reason. And so what we need to do is, using good analytics, we need to be able to shine what we call a quantification spotlight on how those worlds combine and interact. In other words, knowing how what happens on the left side of this diagram impacts what happens on the right. Jerry, let's move on. Now, why is this important? and I cannot emphasize this anymore. We've already said the mainframes are key participants in a hybrid cloud environment, but here I had Jerry underline this sentence just for clarity. Not all cloud apps are good citizens in their mainframe interactions. We need look no further than the growing presence of robotic process automation systems and processes within organizations. The way most of them are interacting with legacy applications running on the mainframe is not good, not effective, not efficient. And so just because something is interacting with the mainframe doesn't mean it's happening in a way that fosters the organization's goals technologically or business-wise. It can, in fact, sometimes the way this integration occurs creates a quagmire. I was in a customer conversation about 2 years ago almost now, and this diagram on the bottom right really came from that conversation. He called me, and I had known him from another customer, and now he went on and worked at another organization much larger, and he called me and said, "Hey Russ, I think we got a problem." I go, "Okay, what's that? I love problems. This is great." He said, "Well, our business is growing just fine, right? Every year it's growing great." But he said, "Here's the problem. Our CICS transaction volume is growing exponentially relative to the underlying business volume. And we are desperately close. In fact, I think it's probably, if we put a pencil to it, the marginal value of the increased revenue is less than the marginal cost of actually fulfilling the business." And so yet another, and we'll actually talk about this particular customer in a moment. I'll show you a diagram of what we determined. But it's really important to say these are the sorts of use cases we're after when it comes to integration analytics. We want to assess operational impact. We want to estimate the cost of suboptimal integration. When I say cost, I don't just mean words. I mean values. I mean CPU seconds, CPU hours, dollars spent. We want to also be able to not just say, aha, there's a problem. We want to say, that's the problem. We want to identify the low-hanging fruit for optimization or remediation. Jerry, let's go on to the next slide. What we've developed as part of our process when we do such an engagement is an analytics framework. Now, obviously, we're focused here in this slide on CICS applications. And what we do is we, as part of our analytics process, is we extract data. Essentially, really, the basis of it is your SMF 110 data that's already being produced. And we may enrich, we have certain tools to be able to enrich the 110 data with intelligence about the requests that come in on the left side of this diagram. But then we move that data down to Splunk. Now, I'm going to utter the word Splunk many times because that is the analytics platform that we choose to use, and we've developed most of our analytics tools around. That does not mean that you need to own Splunk in order for us to do an engagement. The last 3 or 4, we used one of our instances of Splunk. The customer sent us their 110 data, and we were able to yield the analytics that they or we needed to be able to do it. But that's kind of technically, that's the framework. We're going to harvest data from the mainframe. We're going to move it down to a robust analytics platform, and we're going to look at it every which way you can imagine to look for insights as to how the hybrid world is driving the mainframe world. Jerry, next slide. Now that's really just the first step in our process, and Phil will describe some of our combined deliverables that we provide to our customers a little bit later. But we go through this 5-step process where the first is the retrieval of the data. We then do some intake of the data. We index it into Splunk. Then we do some basic analysis and evaluation and some dashboarding of it. We've done this enough now that we have a whole little treasure trove of analytic tools to be able to look and scan the data for various patterns and use cases. So the more we do it, the smarter we get. and the more tools we have. Some days we sort of feel like we are a radiologist looking at X-rays, and then able to hopefully put our fingers on where the bad bits and where the bad cells might be. Ultimately, our goal is to be able to give to a customer a solid presentation where we can discuss key findings. And not just that, we can actually show them analytics and create operational insight. And Jerry, on the next slide, we kind of show that. I'm a real nerd about analytics. So Jerry, let's go to the next slide. We don't have enough time to really go into some of these, the analytics that we can now produce. But suffice it to say that we're able to see the impact of all sorts of things, quantify it, and for many customers, be able to put our finger on exactly where they need to start the optimization or modernization journey. Let me tell a story about 3 use cases that we've been involved in recently. Jerry, let's go to the next slide. This is an insurance company, and this insurance company does all their processing on a System Z. The application infrastructure comes from a vendor, and they've been scaling up, they've been growing, good for them, but this is one of those customers where they began to realize that doing something very simple that's in their best interest to do, like add a new vehicle to a policy, that was having some sort of a bad interaction on the back end that was costing them way more than they expected. So we gathered the necessary data, we defined the objective, and what we were able to reveal is that adding one vehicle to a policy was spawning, and this is the real number, approximately, when it was all said and done, about 7,000 DB2 calls, which, given the way the vendor had defined their application to CICS, was causing 14,000 what we call TCB switches, very inefficient, generating for every, or wasting for every policy being added, and many other operations, about 28 million unnecessary instructions. Now, when you can get it down to that level where you can say, okay, someone did this out in my world and it cost me this, and they can see the problem with that degree of specificity, then it becomes simple to go back and to put your finger on it. In this case, they went back to the vendor and they said, hey, we need you to embrace the modern CICS environment. We need you to get everything off of the QRTCB that you can. We need you to run your code on an open TCB. And for those of you who are CICS nerds, you know what all that means. Bottom line, the vendor complied, and this organization is running far more efficiently today than they were a year ago. Jerry, next slide. This is another organization, comes out of a manufacturing use case, where the mainframe is used as the Uber materials requirements planning management system. But there's all sorts of devices and systems on the factory floor that are constantly interacting with those mainframe-based applications. So we were able to spot 2 things. One is they were sending way too many discrete requests and responses back to the mainframe. Why? Because they had no API defined to actually do that. They had no business API defined. But the second thing that was kind of news to all of us, and frankly, I almost kind of hated telling them about it. And well, I didn't hate it. I mean, it's glad I could do it, but it's the first time I've seen this in a long time. We were able to detect that literally 20% of all their SMF records, all their SMF 110s, were being generated by what we call user event monitoring points that someone defined maybe a decade ago, maybe more. And they defined them at that time for good and valuable reasons, and they gathered some metrics or whatever, and they've been running ever since, but no one knew they were there. No one really looked at the data. And so talk about overhead. We were able to very quickly put our finger and say, you know, you really ought to reevaluate whether or not anyone is looking at that data, because you're generating you're 20% of all your SMF records are being generated as a result of these user event monitoring points. So not only are they looking at that, they're also looking at a product that we happen to sell, an integration product, to create a more effective API and quit sending thousands or hundreds of thousands of discrete requests to the mainframe. Jerry, next slide. This is a use case of a global IT logistics company. In fact, I bet there's probably about, if whatever technology you're using today to watch this, there's probably about a 40 to 50% chance that technology flowed through one of their warehouses somewhere around the world. But IBM System Z is mission critical as part of their application infrastructure. And so their global field sales force all around the world, though, live in Excel. And over the passage of time, decades, people have written various kinds of Excel macros. And these Excel macros then interact with the mainframe via terminal emulation and screen scraping. Now, don't get me started on that, because nothing is a less effective means or mode of integration than terminal emulation and screen scraping. But they had this problem globally, and so we stood up our integration analytics. We first of all did the integration analytics using our systems to see the problem. They then actually licensed the software to run it daily on their own infrastructure so they can see what's really going on. What it revealed were huge opportunities for optimization, to reduce their transaction volume, to define API requirements. And that really leads us into this next slide, Jerry. We see a lot of organizations continuing to try to achieve integration or modernization objectives using 3270 or terminal-oriented user interfaces. What they should be doing is focus on defining APIs. In the world in which we live, we should be exposing from the mainframe to the outside world business-oriented APIs, and the implementation details behind those APIs should be sequestered purely on the mainframe. Why? The definition of that API gives that organization agility. The API creates the pivot point so that an organization can move, can evolve. If the distributed world is always having to attend to or know of the integral details of a screen, a comm area, a this or a that, you're doomed from a modernization standpoint, because the technology interlock between the distributed side and the mainframe side is just too tight. We need to build more loosely coupled components. Jerry, let's go on. Now, I only included this slide for one reason. Last week, I had a conversation with the CIO of organization, and we did a presentation, something like this, but in a bit more detail. And she kind of jumped ahead and said, okay, hey, Russ, I am really confident that we have, if not every problem you just described going on, I bet we have one or two of them in spades. So are you just going to tell me we have a problem, or you can help me solve this problem? And I said, look, yes, we can help you solve the problem. We do offer integration software products to help build APIs and deal with these issues. But I put this slide here as much as anything to say, our approach now is we do analytics first. Then we talk about solutions. Jerry, next slide. So let's begin to summarize a little bit and move. And now I've been talking bottoms up. It's time to talk top down again. Let's go to the next slide, Jerry. So
okay, and Russ, as we do that, what I'd like to invite everyone, we are entering the home stretch of our presentation today, and we would love to hear your thoughts about what you've heard and also take your questions. So feel free right now or through the rest of the presentation to use the Q&A or the chat panel, either one, to tell us what you're thinking.
Yeah, great. So I've kind of gone down into the weeds. I mean, we are technologists that do the analytical work from the bottom up. And as I said before, we believe the best practice is to take a far more holistic approach. We want to create alignment, not only at the bits and the bytes level and the integration level, but also at the top of the organization to ensure that we are really hitting the bogeys and the marks that the organization has for why they own System Z in the first place. And with that, let me introduce or pass the baton back to Phil to talk about their unique discovery and consultative process. Phil?
Thank you, Russ, and that was a great job. I mean, you really hit on a lot of the points that pretty much every single one of my clients, as soon as they get to the point where they have to look at the specific applications and figure out what to do from a performance perspective, as well as a modernization perspective, the tools and the services that you guys provide. I mean, that's the whole reason that we're here today. Jerry, let's go to the next slide and let me talk a little bit about the overall process, because we really have been doing this for quite a while. We have really 4 specific objectives. And the first thing, as Russ said, we really do come at this with our clients from a top-down perspective. So we do start with interviewing the senior IT management staff, as well as the key lines of business areas, because the first thing that we want to focus in as we consult with the client on how to approach their transformation is how well do the business objectives that you've set out for your organizations, how well do they actually align with your IT strategy and the investments that you're making in IT? And typically, the mainframe is a very significant piece of that, of course. So we don't only focus on the mainframe aspect of it. We are quite holistic, but we always start with the client at the top of what are the business objectives and what does your IT support need to be so that your line of business can actually deliver the revenue and profit that you need. So when we do look at the infrastructure, we are looking at the mainframe, of course, but we're also looking at all the things that the mainframe needs to connect with and talk with. So we review that. We look at the optimization of the mainframe environment. We review the entire IT architecture, but especially the mainframe elements of that. And then we dig down into the key application areas. I spoke a little bit about that earlier, about the different segments of the portfolio, the things that are going to go away, the things that are stable, working great. And then these are the key applications that we really need to focus our modernization on in order to really be able to grow revenue and deliver the IT support that we need to. So let me show you what the deliverable for that is. So Jerry, if you can advance to the next slide. After about a 4 to 6 week period, it really depends on the size of the organization, the company and the IT organization as well. We create a formal report that goes to the project sponsors, and we really focus in on actionable recommendations. So it's not just a list of things, it's very prioritized that says this is where the bang for the buck is going to be based on the things that you do. Here are the results that you are going to get. Typically, once I deliver that report, the sponsor sometimes happily, sometimes they're not so sure how happy they are to be there. But typically within the week, they are sitting down with the CTO, the CIO to go through the recommendations that are in the report. Now, one of the things that we are integrating into this report with the help of the HostBridge team is this piece that Russ just spoke about around the integration analytics, the dashboards that really gives an additional level of insight and value that factors into the recommendations that we have for the clients. And then one thing that I've always done quite often within an organization, you guys will know this, sometimes the mainframe team isn't looked at, doesn't necessarily have the seat at the table that they want with the executive team. Pretty often I'll get asked to do executive summary presentation with the executive team that tends to be not only the CIO, CTO, but also of the key line of business areas, the key folks who own the applications, to really go through the report with them and really have a dialogue with them so that we become part of their team in helping them determine what steps to do next. So let me tell you just a little bit more detail of what's in these reports. And Jerry, if you can go to the next slide, I'll just kind of take folks through that. Nope, the one right before that. There you go. I said right up front, right, budgets are under tremendous amount of constraints, and every client I've ever had, the first thing they want to know is, how do I save money? And they want to be able to save money because they want to be able to invest not just in maintaining applications, they want to be able to invest in the IT transformation, the business transformation that they need to get done. So that's always the first thing that they want to talk about. Second, coming out of the application reviews, which are the applications that you want to target first for API enablement so that you can connect to cloud native applications in the right way. As they're doing that, it becomes very critical for us to assess their application testing environment. Most mainframe clients haven't invested much in the application setup for their organization. They do a kind of a rudimentary functional test but typically they don't have as strong a regression test bucket as they want to have to retest their applications. And we have plenty of expertise in that area, and we help them look at that. And then the DR piece of it is a lot of customers will have a disaster recovery machine that's sitting somewhere, not really getting used. And we also help them in making more productive use of that asset that they have sitting in DR. We create that alignment. I spoke about it earlier, about aligning the IT strategy with the actual digital transformation plans that the company has. And typically there is a tweak to the IT architecture that needs to be done. It's not quite in alignment. It's not quite as responsive as it needs to be. And it also means that the relationships within the organizations themselves on how the key application areas interact with their lines of business, we take a look at those relationships as well. And then part of all of that, of course, is the skills that they have to go implement the recommendations that they choose to move forward with. So there's a lot of really good information. The reports tend to be, 15 to 20 pages long or so, at least a dozen or so recommendations. So it's really pretty comprehensive for them. And then they really tend to want to go off and figure out, okay, which of these things can we do ourselves? And then which are the kind of things where are we going to want your help, or can you help us find somebody else who has the expertise that we need? So with that, I think that's a pretty good summary. Jerry, why don't we open it up to Q&A and also see if Russ has any additional comments he'd like to make.
No, I think we have some questions that I see coming in, so that's more important than anything I have to say. I just want to say, these sorts of we want this sort of a process for our customers to be very tangible, very deliverable. We want to yield actionable intelligence, things to do to make your System Z operation far more optimal and far more valuable to your organization. Jerry?
Yes, well, we do have several questions, so thank you for that, and feel free to enter your questions through the chat panel, and we will get to as many of them as we can, hopefully all of them. Here's the first one, and it's really kind of in two parts. So the first question is, does the SMF 110 cover the whole trip from end user to CICS IMS transaction? And then that same attendee asked a follow-on, how do we measure distributed parts of transaction? We are currently flying blind in this area.
Yeah, good. Those are both excellent questions. First of all, the technical answer to your question is, does the SMF 110 cover the distributed part? No. However, there's a no but. And that is that what we provide with our analytics offering is a bit of software that runs under the covers of CICS, and it sits on a couple of exit points. And what this software does is it looks at various types of requests that come in, and it grabs little bits of data or metadata about the request. And then we take that and we cause it to be saved as part of the CICS monitor data. Well, once we've done that, then that metadata that we've extracted will automatically be included in the SMF110 data. So imagine that you have a lot of HTTP traffic coming in, and one of the headers perhaps on that HTTP request is a correlation ID. And in fact, I'll bet money it's there because most distributed systems, when they send an HTTP request in, always include a correlation ID of some type. But there's nothing under the covers of CICS that automatically extracts that and then causes it to be able to be included in the SMF data stream or in the SMF record. That's part of what we're doing, that little bit of code that's running on the mainframe that can do very efficiently. So while the SMF110 data, the record itself, only covers the transaction that ran under the covers of CICS, by virtue of having enriched that SMF110 record with some correlation data or some request-specific data, we can then, when we bring it down to Splunk, we can match it up with other log data from the distributed system, and we can create a complete end-to-end picture of what's going on. Happy to discuss that further offline as well. Now let's go to this idea of these dependent transactions, because what we, in a large organization, what we see is, okay, a request comes in, you're going to run transaction A, then it's going to run transaction B, and you have this long chain of events that happen. Now, I want to give a shout out to IBM because starting in a late version 4 now, and it really became mature in version 5, they created kind of a bit of infrastructure under the covers that they call transaction tracking. And you know that metadata that I said I extracted when the request came in or the response goes out? We handle it in such a way, just right, so that CICS automatically includes it as part of that so-called origin data or transaction tracking data. Thus, the correlation information follows each of the dependent transactions. As a result, when the data settles on Splunk, we can literally stitch them all together. And we can see that, okay, a request came in from, let's say, a WebSphere server. And that request sent in this or whatever, maybe came in through MQ or HTTP or, heaven forbid, 3270 data streams. I don't say heavens forbid. I say that humorously, hopefully, because that is quite a prevalent use case for us. And then we're able to stitch together by virtue of having grabbed that data and metadata. Now, when we get everything done on Splunk, we can show you that end-to-end picture.
So very good. So we have a few other questions. Phil, I'm going to tee this one up for you. This one's not quite as technical, and then we're going to follow it up with another technical question. So the question is, our organization is always looking for ways to free up budget money to spend on modernization. And so what are some of the best areas to focus on if we want to do that?
Great question. Now, one of the first places to look is the efficiency of the applications and how the workload flows. So typically most mainframe clients, the processes are typically kicked off and they follow a certain pattern throughout the day and then throughout the week and then throughout the month. So one of the things that we always look at is the use of the assets that tends to drive software costs. Software tends to be priced in this environment based on the peak utilization of that system in a month. That's true of the IBM software, the monthly license charge software, the operating system, et cetera. It's also true for most of the mainframe tooling, both from IBM as well as all other vendors. So one of the first things that we do take a look at is there an effective use of the software? We look at all the software that's being used. Is it all being used productively? Or are you spending money on software you don't necessarily need? Then the other thing that we look at is we'll do a very detailed analysis of when different workloads peak throughout the month, which then drives the software costs for those products or those tools. So it's not unusual for a number of clients who haven't really followed through with how their performance tuning has changed over the years. It wouldn't be unusual for us to find performance improvements or peak reductions, I should say, of 10, 15, 20%. And then it's also looking at the LPARs, how workload is distributed, et cetera, different shifts. There are times that later shifts aren't used anywhere near as heavily, and this workload balancing that can be done. So that is one of the primary areas, is around the software, and that is both in where the peaks are for the software, and then for software that's really not used very often, or is that is potentially redundant with other pieces. Let's see if there's anything else to add there, Jerry, or
yes, actually, we've had a couple other things come in. So one, I just want to give some information based on a question here. Someone asked if there was an explanation of what the software Russ described. If there's an explanation or a diagram or a write-up available, yes, there is for sure. If that's something you'd like to get some more information on, I would ask you to send us an email, and you can send it either to Russ directly, or if you want to, perhaps, no offense to Russ, get a bit faster response, you can send it to info@hostbridge.com, and that will reach myself and one of my colleagues, and we'll be able to get that to you. So if you'd like
what exactly are you inferring by that?
You know, Russ, sometimes you're not quite as attentive to emails as I would like. That's all I'm saying. Now, we've had another question, and this one is, what are the main reasons that drive an application to be targeted for API enablement?
That's a great question, and I think it deserves both a top-down and a bottom-up explanation. From a top-down, I mean, it has to do with strategic intent, right? If this is an application that really is strategic to an organization, and in terms of deployment over the long term, or as part of your, demand chain interactions or your supply chain interactions, and by all means, that's a leading indicator. If this is critical infrastructure at the top, from a top-down view, this app is, and this functionality, then by all means, that gives us a good indicator. Technically, when I look at things under the covers, it's pretty easy to tell those apps that would benefit from having a formal API cast, and particularly, I'm not sure who answered the question, but I'd be more than happy to do a subsequent Zoom or WebEx to actually show them. When we actually look at the data flows, we're able to stitch together the sequence of operations. That's what's really going on under the covers between the outside world and the interior side of CICS, and it becomes really clear that kind of these repetitive patterns. So, for example, we were doing a study for one customer just last month, where it was very clear that every morning, every sales rep clicked a button, a refresh button on a particular spreadsheet, and lo and behold, under the covers, that clicking that one button, actually they clicked the button and they went for coffee. They went for coffee because when they clicked the button, it ran about 4,000 to 5,000 transactions. Now, I think we can all agree that 4,000 to 5,000 interactions back and forth between a client workstation halfway around the world and your mainframe might be a good indicator that there should be an API wrapped around that functionality. That sort of pattern of interaction and that sort of flurry of interactions back and forth is highly inefficient, and it generates latency like crazy. That's why they all went off and got coffee after they clicked the refresh button. it turned out that things like that. So the data kind of tells us what we need, but it would always be informed by Phil's assessment or your assessment, someone's assessment of the strategic intent around that app.
Yeah, so and let me just embellish that a little bit. In the selection, because there's always we all have lists of things we'd like to get to. So prioritizing the ones that we're going to attack and that you're going to attack becomes very important. So it's not only the strategic nature of the application. Executives would tend to like to go after the what we call the low-hanging fruit first, right? So where can I get a bang for the buck for the smallest possible investment? So as we get into reviewing applications with you, we're also looking at things like do you have an architect who really has a good understanding of not only that application, but the interaction of that application with the 3 or 4 others that it will tend to interact with. And then in addition, what is the documentation around there, the level of skills for the developers working on that to actually go in and make the changes. And then, of course, there is an assessment of the structure of the application itself, the availability of the source code, but really its structure, and is it an application that really lends itself to easily inserting an API without unduly increasing path length. So that's all those things kind of come into the analysis. So there's a lot to consider, but Russ is right. It starts with that prioritization of which are the ones that are most important to your organization. And then followed by that, it's where are the ones where you can demonstrate success to your executive team earlier and get significant benefit from it.
Yeah, I might just add one more thing. We've done so much work. I've mentioned 3270 terminal emulation and screen scraping as an integration technique. There's just so much of that still out there. And I hope, and so much so that we've actually built particular technology based around Splunk to be able to deduce what we call the DNA, so to speak, of these robotic or these automated processes. And when we run your SMF 110 stream it through this, we're actually able to see kind of the sequence of the flow and with the DNA of the bot, so to speak. And our objective is to be able to show the DNA at such a level so that a subject matter expert on that application can look at that and kind of have an aha moment. Because a lot of these RPA bots or Excel macros or things in the distributed world were developed for a reason, and maybe for a good reason, right? And someone thought that it'd be easier for them to write an Excel macro or a bot than call up the IT department and say, gee, I'd really like this. And a decade later, we're still running the macro. So we actually have particular dashboards that will show you the DNA of these automated processes. And from there, it's almost child's play to make decisions about where your top priorities should be.
I think we have the opportunity maybe to squeeze one more question. We're almost at the end of our time, but Phil, this one I think kind of follows along nicely to what you all were just discussing, and that is we have hundreds of apps running on our mainframe. How can we figure out where to prioritize for whatever form of modernization, refactoring, replatforming?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's really the answer. It's a combination of the conversation that we just had on the last question, and then one of the earlier ones before that, which is looking at how your mainframe systems perform through time and where the peaks occur. So as an example, you may have applications that are running there that you say, well, they're stable, we're not really investing. We could re-platform them to somewhere else without too much trouble, but that application tends to be using most of its runtime in what we would call a trough. So I don't have a slide in this deck, but anyone who's familiar with the SCRT data that maps the performance minute by minute and hour by hour of your mainframe, right, which drives all of your software costs, you're paying base at the peak, but there's lots of troughs in between there. So by doing an analysis on the applications on when they're most used, if it's something that's running in that trough, it's really not worthwhile to go and even consider for replatforming. It's looking at, comparing the data that Russ is talking about, where you can say, hey, we have this, it's driving a lot of activity, it's during peak time, it's delaying responses. Those tend to be the applications that you want to go out first. And then the other important thing is, as you're on your transformation journey of communicating, right, as you're putting up services, what are the cloud native applications that really would get the benefit? So it also takes a lot of communication. And typically one of the recommendations that we come up with is to improve the organizational communication within the company so that there's essentially a council that's made up of the key application owners from the mainframe side, and then the line of business folks who are working on driving revenue and profit, because most of the time they're not even aware of what things that are on the mainframe that would save them having to do stuff on the other side, where they could just tap into assets that are already there. So it's really important to have cross-functional communication between business areas and IT, as well as between mainframe and non-mainframe within IT.
Wow. Well, let me first thank our presenters, and hopefully those of you on the call understand just how much experience and wisdom they have to share. Let's keep the conversation going. You see the email addresses on the screen. HostBridge is very active on LinkedIn, so we invite you to go follow us there. And we have resources to help you. You see our optimization ebook displayed on the screen. If you'd like that, you can either go to the URL or just send us an email, and we'll make sure you get it. But we hope you found this helpful. Let us know what we can do to help you. Thank you so much for spending part of your day with us.